I still have a cold that I had when I saw you in July. So it's not COVID, but it's a cold. I can't seem to get rid of it. I did go see my doctors in Montreal, and they have a plan. But so I don't know. I hope to be cured in a few weeks.
My questions will focus on your time as Minister of Public Safety. I'll ask my questions in English, but of course, please answer in the language of your choosing. The Commission has heard evidence that historically within public safety, there were some issues or inability to fully account for what intelligence and information was received and disseminated to the Minister's office. To the best of your knowledge, have those issues been resolved?
My strong impression is that they have been. We've all taken note of those concerns over a number of years. If I think about how intelligence information or security material is shared with me or my senior staff, there's an extraordinarily elaborate, as is totally appropriate, tracking of who's seen what at what time, in what locked filing cabinet is a certain document, who took it out. It's a very elaborate and I think rigorous system now to track and confirm who has seen what piece of information.
Can you tell us how you generally receive intelligence? Is it through verbal briefings, through written intelligence products, weekly reading binders, all of the above?
Yeah, I'd start with all of the above. It depends on the particular context. If I'm at home in New Brunswick, there's a secure facility and a police RCMP station in Moncton, where often on Fridays I'll go on a top secret video link and be able to talk to officials of CSIS or RCMP or the Public Safety Department. There has been a real, I think, effective effort to ensure that the technology allows me and my successors in this job to be able to receive in a safe way this information. So that's one example. A lot when we're in Ottawa during a week when Parliament's sitting or when I'm here, there'll be meetings in secure locations at the Public Safety Department, sometimes at the Privy Council office, where officials from CSIS will talk to me about specific issues. And all pieces of intelligence information, and I've learned all this over the last 15 months, I wouldn't have known this a year and a half ago, are not equal. Some is an interesting analysis done over a period of time on a particular question, a particular trend, a particular country. Some are more pressing in the sense that if there are decisions to be made, approvals to be granted, that has a higher level of urgency. And I have always insisted that the CSIS director and the deputy ministers reach out to me personally, and the chief of staff in my office is copied, but I don't want to have filters as between me and those senior officials. And I'd much rather they phone me or wake me up on a Friday night with some urgent matter than find out 2 days later that we missed a window. So it's quite free-flowing. In some cases, it's informal. It's a text message. Do you have some time this afternoon to speak on a secure phone? Sometimes it's more formal, where you go into one of these secure locations and there's a more formal briefing. So it's sort of it's a spectrum of different interactions, but I'm quite comfortable that I have access to the information I need to do my job, and I have a lot of confidence in the women and men who work in our department and at CSIS and the RCMP, knowing when and what I should be, what I should see, and I have every confidence that they get it to me with the urgency that is required.
And specifically in relation to warrant applications, you mentioned in your in-camera evidence that there are rigorous protocols in place to ensure that warrants reach you in a timely manner. Can you describe those protocols or procedures, and if you're satisfied with them?
I am satisfied with them. Again, I've learned this over the last number of months. The warrants that are prepared and ultimately go to the Federal Court of Canada for CSIS, a former Minister of Public Safety told me when I got this job that the warrants are like the crown jewels for CSIS because of the sensitivity of the information in the various affidavits and what's contained, but also in the ability for them to do the work that Parliament and Canadians expect them to do. Typically, and again, not every warrant is the same in the sense some can be extremely urgent. It can be a developing high-risk situation where there's an urgency for CSIS to have these authorities and they quickly schedule an appearance before the federal court. There have been a few of those recently where you really have the sense that time is of the essence for them to ask the court for these authorities. In that case, I would get a message from my chief of staff saying, we're going to get a warrant tomorrow that CSIS would like returned by the end of the day. What's your schedule? Where are you? I often go to CSIS offices in Edmonton a few weeks ago, in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. If I'm traveling, CSIS has offices in every province with the facilities for me to review and execute these warrants. I've done it on a few occasions if there's an urgency, but typically we know a warrant is coming. The department, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety recommends to me the approval of a warrant. So the first sort of memo on the warrant application is a confirmation, including legal advice from the department, recommending that I would approve it. That back and forth between the Deputy Minister and the National Security staff at the Public Safety Department, I'm told can take sometimes 6-7 days. It depends, again, on the nature of the warrant. Once the Deputy Minister signs the recommendation and the warrant comes to my office, to my minister's office, it's typically my most senior political staff person, the chief of staff, who reads them. I want him to read them so he can also provide advice to me. There's one other very senior person with a lot of experience in these intelligence matters sometimes who looks at them. And they'll tell me right away that we have a warrant here. And sometimes CSIS will say, we'd like this executed by a certain date. So they tell us the urgency. We're governed to some extent by their operational requirement. Some cases, these are renewals. So we'll get them sometime in advance because CSIS is renewing something that the court had already approved. I still have to approve the renewal, but you'll see that the urgency of that is different than a new warrant or a novel authority. But our practice has been within, at the most, a couple of days to return them once we get them from the Deputy Minister.
Thank you.
And sometimes it's the same day. Like I try and turn them around the same day. If I'm in Ottawa and I'm going to sign it, I know how important it is for them and I want them to be able to get on with that work.
Understood. Moving on to a separate topic, we've heard evidence from some of your predecessors, Minister Blair, Mr. Mendicino, about a countering foreign interference strategy, previously known as the countering HASA strategy. Court operator, could you bring up CAN 45923? This is an undated memorandum, Minister, requesting a decision from you by August of 2023 in relation to the public release of the unclassified version of Canada's foreign interference strategy. Now, I understand that you did not actually, or do I understand correctly that you did not actually receive this memorandum or the attached draft strategy?
Yeah, I don't have a recollection of seeing that particular document. I saw it in the preparation of this for these hearings.
Okay. And were you aware, however, of that a countering foreign interference strategy had been prepared? Did you review any version of it during your time as Public Safety Minister?
I remember Government of Canada has a lot of strategies, and there's big S strategies and there's small S strategies, and a public-facing document that would be our capital S strategy would be different than discussing in briefings with officials or my staff our collective governmental strategy to counter foreign interference. So those were ongoing and are active, and you can imagine frequent conversations. I was aware that previous ministers, there had been some thought of sort of publishing a forward or a publicly available version of a countering foreign interference strategy. I think in our interview in camera, I talked about events were moving so quickly. So in August 2023, I was working with my parliamentary colleagues to finalize what became this very inquiry. So in terms of a countering foreign interference strategy in August and September, that was, for me, a much higher priority than reviewing a document an unclassified document that would be made public. Canadians have benefited in the last number of months, in my view, an awful lot more from these hearings and the work and the interim report of this commission than they would from the Government of Canada putting on a website a strategy. But also events were quickly overtaking. The problem with a strategy is if we had put that out before Russia invaded Ukraine, if we had put that out before, imagine the countering foreign interference strategy in light of what the RCMP announced yesterday. So there is such a quickly moving series of events. I thought one of the most important things to work on, and this became, again, part of that exercise, we had made a decision to set up, to legislate the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry. And we'd also made a decision to, because there was a window we thought in Parliament, it turned out to be true, and I'm very grateful to the opposition parties for having worked so helpfully with us on that, and members of the Senate. There was a window to make significant changes in strengthening Canada's ability to detect and counter foreign interference, strengthening intelligence legislation, creating new criminal offenses, as well as the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry, that became Bill C-70. So the consultations around that, there were dozens and dozens of meetings across the country involving diaspora groups and others. We thought that was a very significant focus, which led ultimately to that legislation being tabled.
Mr. Tupper, your deputy minister, gave evidence last week and testified that in an ideal world, the government of Canada would put a strategy on paper and have a more conscious communication strategy with Canadians to explain the nature of the work the government is doing in this area. In your view, is the articulation of a whole of government response or approach to countering foreign interference in a written, published format, either classified and internal to government or external to the public, or perhaps both, is that a worthwhile tool for framing the government's approach when specific incidents, as you've just mentioned, arise? Do you see it as a valuable tool going forward?
So I do. I do accept that. I do also share Mr. Tupper's view as well. That is one element in terms of the public seeing the work that's being done. I think if we're going to publish a countering foreign interference strategy, it should, at this point, very much take into account the recommendations of this commission. Because for Canadians, this will be a reference point of significant importance, we believe. So the work continues to be done. Canadians' understanding of the issue, if you just think in the last 3 or 4 years, this is not a threat that started 3 or 4 years ago, but Canadians' understanding, and I don't know how many parliamentary committees I've been called to testify at, and my colleagues from the security agencies and Privy Council and deputy ministers, there has been a whole of government exercise to communicate publicly the work we're doing. Because it's so important, but a document, a public-facing document is absolutely value-added. It's part of the work. But having the clerk of the Privy Council on a June morning in Toronto with hundreds of people at a democracy exchange conference speaking, I spoke at the beginning of the morning, and the clerks stayed for most of the morning, met with the participants, and also spoke to the conference. That's a very powerful way to show interested civil society leaders the work the Government of Canada is doing as well. So I'm encouraging constantly my colleagues to do that work, to speak publicly, including CSIS directors, the RCMP commissioner, and others.
Moving to sharing information with specific individuals and briefings to parliamentarians. I want to ask you first about the sharing of classified information with parliamentarians. As I know, your predecessor, during your predecessor's time as a Minister of Public Safety, there was a ministerial directive issued that set out the parameters for CSIS to inform parliamentarians of threats to the security of Canada directed at them. I'd like to ask you about the implementation protocol for implementing that ministerial directive. Court operator, could I have CAN 21638? And if we could go to page, apologies, page 5 of that document towards the bottom. It says approval. Minister, it indicates here that Public Safety and CSIS were seeking your approval of this protocol to provide formal confirmation that you agree with the approach it outlines. Previous witnesses have testified about this protocol for the implementation of the ministerial directive. Can you tell us what this protocol, what issues or concerns this was aimed at addressing, and whether you did in fact agree with the approach outlined in the document?
So you're right, I did, Public Safety Canada and CSIS were asking me to approve, if you will, the implementation protocol. It was a directive, as you properly noted, that had been issued by a predecessor minister, but there's sort of a governance piece and an implementation piece that they've asked me to approve, which I did. I thought their advice was very appropriate. This is how CSIS will interact with parliamentarians, both in what I hope is an increasingly regular exchange of information and access points. It's certainly something that we would be very well disposed to having CSIS do. But in more specific cases, if there are, as you said, a threat to the security of Canada targeting an individual parliamentarian, CSIS now has all the authorities to interact directly with that parliamentarian. Only in the rarest of cases do they have to seek my approval, and I am very confident that they're doing this work in a very effective way.
Thank you. If we could go to page 11 of that document. There's a mention here under initiation and application that only information on a credible threat to the security of Canada directed at a parliamentarian may be disclosed. Am I correct, Minister, that you are not involved in assessing what amounts to a credible threat or not a credible threat? That's an assessment undertaken by CSIS or the other departments involved in this implementation of the protocol.
That's correct. That would be a decision taken by the officials of CSIS according to their approvals or their normal course of business, but I would not offer a view in that or be consulted.
All right. And then on page 12 of that document, on point 5, it discusses your role, and you've already indicated for us that your approval is only necessary in particular circumstances where the measure being proposed attracts an elevated risk, if I think is the language that's been used previously. Is that right?
Yes, it's a high risk, and I was told that that is actually language that tracks the CSIS legislation, but.
All right.
So a threat reduction measure that is, in their judgment, based on their own criteria, attracting a higher risk, that's when they would ask for my approval.
And otherwise, you're informed of all of these instances, but CSIS would not need to get your approval in order to take a particular step in response.
That's absolutely right. I'm informed, sometimes even post facto, just depending on schedules, but it's interesting because sometimes colleagues will cross the floor of the House of Commons, or if they're on the same side as me, come and sit with me and say, oh, I've been asked to talk to CSIS on whatever date. So it's useful for me just to have a sense of who CSIS is talking to, but it's not an approval, it's just for my information.
Unclassified briefings or sharing information that is not classified. We heard some evidence this morning from staff at the Prime Minister's office about unclassified briefings that were provided to parliamentarians by caucus in June of this year, June 2024. Court operator, could I have CAN 33395? Minister, this is a memo, just as it's coming up, addressed to you. It's dated November 7, 2023, requesting your approval for approval of material which would be used by national security officials to brief members of the House or members of Parliament and their staff on foreign interference. Did you give your approval for these materials? And did you provide any feedback on them? Or were you able to explain what steps were taken after you received this memo?
So yes, I did ultimately approve these materials. That approval, I thought about this when I reread this document and and I know that the briefings to parliamentarians is a source of some focus of your work. I think it's important to understand the context. Groups of public servants, particularly in the public safety department, don't usually go around meeting rooms in the West Block of Parliament meeting opposition caucuses. So for the public servants, or Sébastien, the countering foreign interference coordinator, and others, this is for them an uncomfortable space or an unusual space. They do these briefings extraordinarily well, but it's not sort of in their normal monthly routine. So they would want me, because they're going to see parliamentary colleagues of mine, they would want me to approve or be aware of how they plan to do these meetings. So I understand that. I don't think it's not a technical approval in some legal sense, but they would, because it's out of their normal routine of business, send it up to me for approval. They could have sent it up to me for information as well, but they sent it to me for approval. I thought it's good work. It was well done. The one thing, I've been in Parliament for 24 years. I've been a government backbencher. I've been an opposition backbencher. I've been an opposition House leader. I've sat on the Board of Internal Economy of the House of Commons for almost a decade. Parliament is very sensitive, and appropriately so, for historical reasons, around national police, intelligence agencies coming onto the parliamentary precinct and meeting with members of Parliament. And there's a history that goes back, I'm sure, hundreds of years where these meetings may not have been as successful as I think these ones were. So I thought it was important. The Sergeant at Arms has a responsibility for the security of parliamentarians, the parliamentary precinct. He attends the Board of Internal Economy meetings where all the represented parties are there. I used to be a member for, as I say, a long time. He's well respected. Pat McDonnell has relationships with the whips responsible for different caucuses. So I wanted the department to go and see Pat McDonnell as a senior official of the House of Commons administration, show him what they were planning to present to caucuses, partisan caucuses, as part of the briefing, and ask for his advice and his input. My understanding is that he made some suggestions or some edits, which we of course incorporated. My understanding is they even did a rehearsal with the Sergeant at Arms and his staff, because his judgment is important. And when he would then say to the whip, particularly of an opposition party, I think it's important, or it would be useful to schedule this meeting, it feels different than senior officials of the government going directly to a partisan caucus. So, and the same thing is true in terms of the corporate security director of the Senate. So I wanted that extra parliamentary lens to be applied to it, which it was. As I say, I think we incorporated some edits, and then those meetings were scheduled based on the caucus schedules of the different parties and took place, I think, in June.
And do you have any plans to standardize these types of briefings or to hold them again in the future?
I would hope so. I intend to ask the department to re-engage again with the Sergeant at Arms, who is sort of the interlocutor who would say to the whips of each party or the caucus chairs, would they like an update? Would they like MPs often cross the floor to ask me questions about particular things that are in the news. So I plan to have it as a regular recurring thing, but be governed by the desire of opposition party caucuses or different groups in the Senate to receive this information. But we're absolutely open for business and think that's part of very much building an effective, defensive, informed posture. And I would hope that parliamentarians would take advantage of our willingness to be very accessible and available.
And for the time being, these briefings are completely optional. There is no obligation to attend any of them.
That's right, Madame la Commissaire. La façon que
Madam Commissioner, the way in which the caucus schedule is determined by the caucuses, it's the whip or the president of the parliamentarians groups who decide. And the way that how groups are asked to go, I don't know. I have understood that there's been a good participation because there's much interest in this, but the Sergeant of Arms or department of the government can force the parliamentarians to go, but they're encouraged to go. And the good news, I understood from colleagues who spoke to me afterwards, that it was interesting for them. They were able to ask questions of nonpartisan experts. And I hope that's informed them. And I was led to understand that there was an interest for having additional briefing sessions, and I will also offer it to them if they have specific topics they want to be discussed. Is it digital security? Is it physical security of documents? Maybe some parliamentarians groups from diaspora communities might feel more targeted than others. I would be completely open to asking the experts to make themselves available to talk to them if they would give us specific topics about which they want to be informed.
If I could have just a few moments indulgence. Thank you. Minister, the Commission has heard evidence about political party processes, and in particular nomination contests, being potentially vulnerable to or a potential opportunity for foreign interference. What steps, if any, do you think the government should take to address this potential foreign interference vector?
I think it's an important question, and I know the Commission is seized with this question, and the advice and the recommendations will be important, I hope, for political parties and certainly for the government. There's no doubt that nomination races and leadership conventions, leadership races, are often the entry point for people to participate in a democratic process. Different parties have different rules in terms of who is eligible to vote in a nomination contest, what the age limit might be. It's sometimes different than the Canada Elections Act for voting in a general election or a by-election. This has evolved over time in different political parties that are private entities and have their own governance structures. They meet in public conventions and debate these very rules. So I have participated in Liberal Party conventions where the rules for nomination contests or leadership contests are debated on the floor of the convention. They're voted in a public and transparent way, and then they're administered by what I think are fairly significant internal structures with appeal mechanisms. Often it's lawyers or others that sit on these different groups that supervise these rules. So there is I think, a real effort to get real expertise in all of the political parties to ensure that these rules are respected and are robust. The Chief Electoral Officer, I have noted, obviously with interest, some public comments of the Chief Electoral Officer. He has shared with political parties and me suggestions himself on ways that there can be greater transparency in the rules around nomination and leadership contests. We're looking, obviously, urgently and in a very, I hope, constructive way at these suggestions. Parties are accountable to their own members, and party leaders have in the Elections Act the responsibility to certify candidates. So you can have an internal party process, a nomination, as it's colloquially known, that selects candidate in riding X. But that candidate, he or she is not on the election ballot as an NDP or Liberal or Bloc Québécois candidate or Conservative candidate without the leader of that party issuing an attestation that that's the party candidate. So that is an accountability in the hands of the leader of the party. We have offered to all security-cleared leaders highly classified briefings in terms of threats that the intelligence agencies are perceiving in the democratic process, including theoretically in nomination processes in all parties. We think it's important for leaders of political parties to have access to that information so they can make decisions to ensure that their parties are in the best possible position. I was given some intelligence information about a potential threat to another political party, and my instructions to CSIS were to work with the National Security and Intelligence Advisor and to, as quickly as possible, share that information with the appropriate security-cleared person in that party. I didn't want the Government of Canada to have that information and not ensure that that political party could take the steps in their judgment that qui s'imposaient or that were appropriate.
Minister, sorry to interrupt. We heard some evidence last week from NSIA and senior PCO officials about a process for briefings to opposition parties on intelligence relevant to those parties. Is that the sort of process that you're discussing here?
That is absolutely part of an ongoing process that we think is important. This was a one-off where the particular information I thought was important enough that it should be shared quickly, and it was. But just
to conclude, because I know that I've been speaking at length here.
You should say no, please keep going.
But I do know, however, that the matter of legislating or using an instrument like a bill or regulations following the adoption of a bill, these issues were discussed in the public arena, and I believe we have to be careful. I have sat in Parliament in various contexts, as I stated earlier. In an authoritarian state, it's the party in power that imposes rules upon the internal affairs of another political party or parties. Even in the context of a minority parliament, I believe that two parliamentary groups can agree to legislate internal affairs of another party against its will, well, that's a tricky situation. There's a tradition in Parliament, even with the rules governing parliamentary procedure. The convention is that a majority doesn't change the rules governing the operation of the House of Commons alone. And I know that all political parties are faced with this important question. They must be very aware that they shouldn't be taking measures that threaten the trust of the public. That would be a grave error in my mind. But it's a binary issue. Must you have legislation that governs the internal operations of a political party and do nothing? I believe we could do an awful lot before envisaging a legislative solution. Transparency, as Mr. Perrault suggested, the sharing of information, briefings. I think we can do an awful lot, and we are doing a lot. But the issue of legislating the internal workings of a political party is something that's more complex than people might realize.
Thank you, Commissioner. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you. So we'll take 20